Most people know Steve Jobs as the visionary who helped create Apple, revolutionized personal computers, transformed the music industry, reinvented the smartphone, and became one of the most influential entrepreneurs in history. Today, his name is associated with innovation and success and billions of dollars. But what many people don't realize is that one of the most important moments in Steve Jobs' life wasn't a success at all. It was a devastating failure. In fact, the event that ultimately made Steve Jobs a billionaire was the same event that nearly destroyed his career. He was fired from the very company he helped create. Steve Jobs co-founded Apple in 1976 with his friend Steve Wozniak in a garage. At the time, personal computers were still a new idea. Most people had never even touched one. But Jobs believed computers could become a tool for everyday people, not just large businesses and scientists. Through relentless effort, creativity, and determination, Apple grew rapidly. Products like the Apple II became huge successes, and within a few years, Apple was one of the fastest growing companies in America. As Apple's success increased, so did Steve Jobs' confidence. He was known for demanding perfection and pushing employees to achieve what seemed impossible. While many admired his passion and vision, others found him difficult to work with. Over time, tensions inside Apple began to grow. The company had become much larger, and many executives disagreed with Jobs on how the business should be run. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1985, after a power struggle within Apple, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he had built. Imagine that for a moment. The company you started in a garage, the company you dedicated years of your life to building, the company that represented your dreams and ambitions, and suddenly you're no longer welcome there. For Steve Jobs, it was devastating. He later admitted that he felt like a public failure. News of his departure spread across the business world. Many people believed his career was over. Some thought he would never recover from such a humiliating defeat. He was only 30 years old, and the future that once seemed so bright had suddenly disappeared. Most people would have given up. Most people would have allowed bitterness and disappointment to consume them. They would have spent years blaming others or trying to prove that the world had treated them unfairly. But Steve Jobs made a different choice. Instead of quitting, he started over. Years later, Jobs would describe being fired from Apple as one of the best things that ever happened to him. At the time, he couldn't see it. The pain was too fresh. The disappointment was too great. But losing Apple forced him to rediscover something he had forgotten. He rediscovered his love for creating. Without the pressure of running a massive corporation, Steve became free to experiment again. He founded a new computer company called Next. Although Next never became a huge commercial success, it pushed technology forward and allowed Jobs to continue pursuing his ideas. Around the same time, he purchased a small animation company from Lucasfilm. Most people had never heard of the company. Few believed it would become anything significant, but Steve saw potential where others saw risk. That company was Pixar. For years, Pixar struggled financially. Creating computer animated films was expensive and difficult. There were moments when the company came close to failure, but Steve remained patient. He believed in the people around him and trusted the long-term vision. Then everything changed. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the world's first fully computer animated feature film. The movie became a massive success. Audiences loved it. Critics praised it. And Pixar suddenly became one of the most exciting companies in entertainment. Overnight, Steve Jobs became a billionaire. Ironically, the billionaire status that many people associate with Apple was first achieved because of Pixar, a company he invested in after being fired. But the story doesn't end there. While Steve was building Pixar and Next, Apple was struggling. The company that had once dominated the personal computer industry was losing direction. New products failed to excite customers. Revenue declined. Many wondered if Apple could survive. Eventually, Apple made a surprising decision. They bought Next. And with that purchase came the return of Steve Jobs. The man who had been fired from Apple was now coming back to save it. When Steve returned, Apple was in trouble, but he quickly began simplifying products, improving design, and focusing on innovation. He believed technology should be powerful, but also simple and beautiful. The results were extraordinary. Apple introduced the iMac, then the iPod, then the iPhone, then the iPad. Each product transformed an industry. Apple became one of the most valuable companies in the world. Millions of people carried devices inspired by Steve Jobs' vision. The man who had once been labeled a failure became one of the most admired business leaders in history. But the lesson from Steve Jobs' story isn't about technology. It isn't about building a trillion-dollar company. And it isn't even about becoming a billionaire. The lesson is that failure isn't always the end of the story. Sometimes failure is the beginning of a better one. Being fired from Apple felt like the worst thing that could have happened to Steve Jobs. But if it hadn't happened, Pixar might never have existed. Toy Story might never have been made. Apple might never have experienced its greatest comeback. And Steve Jobs might never have become the person the world remembers today. The turning point wasn't founding Apple. It wasn't launching the iPhone. It wasn't becoming a billionaire. The turning point was the moment Steve Jobs refused to let failure define him. Because sometimes the setback that breaks your heart is the same setback that builds your future. And that's the failure that made Steve Jobs a billionaire.